Dear friends, I am very happy that our good friend Professor Jenny Гэлбрейт is here with us. He is participating at the Gaidar Forum. Yesterday he had a discussion there, and today he has a small period of time, free time, and so he decided to come to us, and we are grateful to him for this. Thank you so much, Jenny. And Jamie agreed to tell us about his perception of what's going on in different spheres, and I'm not going to enumerate them right now because I can make a mistake, but we agreed that he also will touch upon the point of the situation in the United States presidential campaign there, and we know that Jamie is an influential member of the team of Bernie Sanders, so his point of view, his perception of what's going on there is very important, and I think that it will be very interesting for all of us. And before giving the floor to Jamie, I would like to inform you that a couple of weeks ago he received a prize offered by Association for Evolutionary Economics, and of course we congratulate him with this event, and he delivered there a lecture, and we distributed it here, so you have it. This is his lecture he gave on January 3, it seems to me, yes. And it's interesting that the prize is very important, and very well-known people were and are the recipients of this prize. His father as well was one of the recipients of the prize, as well as Minsky, Mins, and Myrdal. Yes, so we congratulate you, Jamie, with this prize. It's really, we are happy for you and glad that your research work has been so highly estimated by your colleagues. So the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Sasha. It's a tremendous pleasure. And I do want to say that the Veblen Commons Prize, which is named after the two leading figures of American institutionalist economics, Thorstein Veblen and John R. Commons, was a distinct honor. It gave me an opportunity to reflect a bit on the trajectory of my intellectual life, which is what that lecture attempts to summarize. And I wanted to say it's also to Sasha that I can correct your introduction in one respect, which is it's not the case that I took time out from the Gaidar Forum to come here. The actual situation is that I accepted the invitation to the Gaidar Forum because it gave me an opportunity to come here.
Thank you for this correction.
So it's really a pleasure to be here, with my friends who I've known and worked with for many years. So what I'd like to do today is to give you a kind of overview of the economic and political situation in the United States as I see it. Some of the, let's say, social context for the presidential campaign, which is a very interesting outgrowth of developments that have been underway in the U.S. now for many years. I would put a significant turning point as being the early 1990s. So looking at and a quarter of a century or a bit more as the epoch that we are, whose consequences we're now dealing with. To summarize the economic situation, which is of which the dominant event was a decade ago, the great financial crisis, which brought home some of the vulnerabilities of the growth and development model that had been the leading feature of the American economy for a long period before that. We have, in the decade since, enjoyed, experienced, I think is probably a better word, a long but relatively slow economic expansion, which has had the effect of reducing the unemployment rate, bringing, if you like, I don't like the term labor market, but bringing the employment situation into a state of some balance, at least as far as the relationship between those seeking work and those obtaining it is concerned. But it's a low unemployment rate that is characterized by a substantially lower rate of participation in employment, labor force participation, than was the case before. A good part of the population that was working before the crisis has taken early retirement or otherwise simply ceased to search for work. Very low growth of wages as the distribution of employment has become substantially, deepening a long-standing trend, substantially located in the services sector, where wage rates are, generally speaking, mediocre. And the job quality that is available has not been terribly good. So you're looking at a great many jobs which are of a kind of low-grade service employment character. Along with this, and in particular, well, something will come to a very strong sense of regional imbalance in the country between areas of very considerable apparent prosperity and areas of very deep economic stagnation and neglect. There is a certain sense of a human crisis, a kind of a slow unfolding of difficulties, which is evident in a rising rate of mortality among certain demographics, particularly older men, older white men, and in a deepening sense of the crisis of drug abuse, particularly opioids, painkillers, which has obviously lethal effects in important respects, but also is debilitating for the population. And also a certain sense of physical deterioration, a country where things are not being adequately maintained, true of roads, true of cities, true of the systems that support cities. You have one true of the public services in important respects. And against this, you have in certain parts of the country symbols of deeply concentrated wealth. As the American city, particularly the coastal cities like New York, Boston, and San Francisco, were once let's say, the center of corporate power and ostentation. So skyscrapers of New York in the 1920s and 1930s were built as emblems of the power of the American company. What you have now are, in some sense, disfiguring the skylines. And it's true in my hometown, which is Austin, Texas, as well. Are the buildings high-rise condominiums for wealthy urbanites. You can see this flying to New York. It hits you in the face. And some other symbols, the very flashy, overpriced universities that are part of the American scene. I graduated from several of them. They're unrecognizable to me now. And the out against a landscape which is, in many other respects, deteriorating. What this is, I think, a characteristic of is a very deep social divide. And it's not so much economic, because there are people with relatively low incomes on both sides of the divide, as it is cognitive. I would say relatively low incomes, also people who are relatively middle class on both sides of the divide. But it's a question of cognition. It's a question of how people perceive themselves in their participation in the society. My friend and colleague Michael Lind has a book called The New Class War, which is just getting a lot of attention. It was reviewed in a very hostile fashion on the front page of the New York Times Book Review just a couple of days ago, and he had a major essay in the Wall Street Journal. It describes the defining feature of the American system now as a managerial overclass. I'm not sure managerial is the right word. I would call it an educated class of urban professionals. And educated in the sense of having gone to the American college or university, which is not necessarily a place where one acquires particular expertise or talent in any given discipline. So I wouldn't describe this class as being highly skilled in the sense that I think most people think of the purpose of education, at least people who have a kind of classical view of the matter. But rather people who are, by virtue of having been through this system, tied to each other by a common structure of beliefs. And the major feature of those beliefs is their own idea of their own special place in the world, the exceptionalism, their exceptionalism in American society, and American exceptionalism in the larger world. The major metric of this success is not necessarily personal accomplishment of, as I say, any traditional kind, but acquisition of means, money, its visibility, celebrity, and stature in the community, which is something quite distinctive from mastery of any particular discipline or any particular line of training or accomplishment. And I think this is fairly obvious to observers within American society who are not themselves members of this relatively privileged group, and it's aggravating and infuriating to them. And what you see is, in effect, from the people who are on the other side of the divide, people who are ordinary working people, craftspeople, people with trades, people who are in service occupations of one kind or another, people who may once have held manufacturing jobs and don't hold them any longer, people who've had a range of particular skills that they acquired perhaps on the job and are now reduced to what essentially very relatively low-skilled service activities. These people are resentful. They, I think, see quite clearly that the people who have the privileged positions in society have them, as I say, by virtue of certain ceremonial rituals that they've passed through and their connections to each other, and not by virtue of let's say, either superior skills or a superior dedication to the common, any common purpose, anything that is shared by people who are not members of the same group. And what happened in the last presidential cycle was a rebellion. It was a clear-cut expression of anger and resentment. And that is what propelled Donald Trump to the presidency. And Trump is a peculiar figure. He's certainly not an authentic at least it's hard to see him as an authentic, enduring political force in his own right. But he expressed very vigorously and effectively this sense of resentment, this sense of dispossession that people feel. And he took advantage of the fact that, for, I think, perfectly understandable reasons, a large part of the population would rather be ruled directly, rather have the government of the United States symbolized directly by an actual oligarch, someone who is, a self-made, it's not self-made, but at least ostensibly successful businessman. Whether Trump is actually as successful as he claimed to be is an open issue, but he certainly projected himself very effectively in that respect. And they'd rather be ruled that way than by people who are asserting a certain, let's say, undeserved or unrecognized capacity to govern, but not doing a very effective job for it, and whom people suspect are actually representing deeper economic and political interests rather than a broader common one. So in some sense quite understandable, and I think fairly widespread view, that it's better to be ruled by someone who is an open oligarch than by someone who is a front for other oligarchs. So the result of this is a pattern of political divisions, which is extremely interesting, and it has a very clear-cut economic dimension, something which one of my most recent doctoral students, Jae-hee Choi, and I are exploring in a paper that will be published a little later this year. It's the relationship between the economic structure of the United States, political party representation, and the outcome of presidential elections, which has now become very clearly defined. The interesting thing is that in order to understand this, one has to take account of the fact that presidential elections in the United States are decided not directly, it's not by popular vote, as you know, it's through an electoral college. And the electoral college, which is roughly proportional to population, slightly overweighted in favor of the smaller states, is allocated on a winner-take-all basis for the most part, according to who has the plurality of the popular vote in each individual state. So what matters is not winning the overall popular vote, but whether you win enough pluralities in particular places to be able to assemble a majority of the electoral college. And this is how Donald Trump became president, even though he had a deficiency of a popular vote that was over 3 million overall, 4 million of those which were in the state of California. Hillary Clinton simply had excess votes where she did not need them, and he had narrow, very narrow pluralities in states which delivered their entire electoral college vote to him, in particular Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Now, if you then look at how the American electorate is distributed between the two parties, and how this has really evolved since the early 1990s, and again, I put 1992 as the turning point. It's very interesting, because the Democratic Party has become a party which occupies largely the two tails of the distribution. So if you think about log incomes as a normal distribution, and you have some dividing lines, the upper tail and the lower tail, the Democrats predominate in both of those. And in the upper tail, what you find are urban professional classes, by and large. So every substantial city in the country, so far as I'm aware, I don't think there's a single exception, is a Democratic city. And that's true in the South, it's true in the North, it's true in the East, it's true in the West. And then the other side of the Democratic coalition is low-income, very low-income communities. So that's largely ethnic minorities. That's the African-American community, Hispanic community, the very small Native American community. But these are all the lowest income communities in the country. You could find them distributed across the Deep South. You can find them along the border with Mexico. You can find them in the Southwest and so forth. But you find them out west in California. And you can find them, of course, in the periphery of the major urban centers. So those two communities, predominantly Democratic. In the middle of the distribution, what you find is the rural population, but especially small towns and small cities. And suburbs, maybe especially suburbs. And those populations are predominantly Republican, predominantly white, and as I say, in the middle of the distribution. So it's an odd fact that there has become, and is increasingly the case over time, that states with very unequal income distributions are the states that are predominantly Democratic, and states with egalitarian income distributions are the states that are predominantly Republican. That's the way the political economy has evolved, and it's really started in the early 1990s with the shifting of the Democratic coalition away from the South, away from the white population of the South, which was an integral part of the Roosevelt coalition, and into essentially a coalition between minority communities and upper income professionals centered on the coast of the country, the East and the West. If one makes a list, and what we did to develop this analysis was something that had not been done before, which was to figure out how to measure economic inequality within each state on an annual basis. Up until the time we tackled this problem, there had been basically only decennial, once every 10-year measures of economic inequality on the universal state basis, because many of the states are very small, and the measures of inequality, which are typically drawn from the current population survey, which is conducted monthly with 60 to 80,000 households, simply the samples for North Dakota, Rhode Island, so forth, are too small to be able to make an accurate estimate of what is happening inside these states. So we combined data sources and techniques that we had developed over a long period of time to fill in the gaps, essentially, and to develop a consistent annual series going back to 1969 and up so far to 2014. And what we found is that the states with the biggest increases in inequality, 14 states, I could recite most of them from memory, but the major ones are California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Nevada, Rhode Island, Hawaii, the District of Columbia, Delaware, Maryland. These states, all without exception, I'm actually not sure about Delaware, Maryland certainly, all without exception voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, every one of them. And of the 20 states with the smallest increases in inequality, there are no states in which inequality declined, but in some cases the increase is very modest from 1969 or 1989. The states with the smallest increases, all but 2 of them voted for Donald Trump. And the 2 exceptions, one of them is New Mexico, which is fairly unique demographically in being at least 40% Hispanic. And the other one is Minnesota, which Clinton won, but only by a very narrow margin, 1.2%. It was a state which used to be very solidly Democratic, but is now on the margin. And so you can see this pattern, it's very clear, and it also reflects an ongoing transition in the demographic political structure of the country. And the transition is the following. The states of the upper Midwest, central mid-Atlantic upper Midwest, of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, all drifting away from the Democratic Party. And the reason they're doing so is that these were industrial states, states with very substantial urban and minority voting blocks, which have now aging out and in relative decline. They were always states which had very strong conservative, let's say, hustings, backwaters, rural and small towns. True of Wisconsin, for example, which is sent Joseph McCarthy famously to the Senate in the 1950s. These states, Michigan, which had Congressman David Stockman in the 1970s, became Reagan's budget director, places like that. The demographic balance is tipping toward the small towns in the countryside and the suburbs, and away from the urban and industrial and formerly highly unionized cities. And those states are becoming, over time, they used to be solidly Democratic. They voted Democratic consistently from the 1980s onward. Now are at contestable and drifting toward the Republicans. And Trump won all four that I mentioned in 2016, and that's what got him the presidency. So that's a real challenge for the Democratic Party. But on the other side, something else is happening across the Southwest and the South. And that is the two populations are growing very rapidly. One of them is the low-income Hispanic population, and the other one is the relatively high-income urban population. And you can see this very clearly: Arizona, Georgia, and Texas. Arizona, now dominated by Phoenix and Tucson, it has practically, I think, already tipped toward the Democratic Party, as Nevada did earlier, dominated by Las Vegas. Georgia nearly did elect, in fact, in 2018, an African-American woman, Stacey Abrams, as governor. She was denied the office by a series of effective voter suppression manipulations. Stacey was a student of mine, graduate of my program, so it's a particularly galling thing. But in any event, Georgia, which has been a Republican state since the Civil Rights era, is now effectively contestable. And Texas is coming along. It's the case that Barack Obama only won 40% of the vote in Texas in 2012. Hillary Clinton won 43% in 2016. A candidate for Senate, Beto O'Rourke, won 49% in 2018. Admittedly, he was running against an incumbent who was a leading Republican, described him as a man who sleeps in a coffin, Senator Ted Cruz. But it was very close. And Texas is drifting toward the Democrats. The largest city in the state, which is the third or fourth largest city in the country, Houston, Harris County, now does not have a single Republican office holder. The thing about the South is that this transition is not mature. It is 43, 45, 46% is not 51. And so it will take several more cycles, even at the rate which I calculate to be maybe 1% a year at this point, for the Democratic candidates at the presidential level to be truly competitive in these states. I don't expect that to be the case in 2020. 2024 is another matter. So that is going to pose a kind of strategic challenge for the Democratic Party. And within the Democratic Party, there's another division. And it's a division which is largely rooted at this point in age differences. It's a difference between old voters and younger voters. The older voters tend to be loyal, and people tend to vote for people they're familiar with. It's just a fact of life. People they're comfortable with, people that they know. This is where, at the present time, Joe Biden has his strength. The younger voters are coalescing around a demand, and have been for years now, since the 2015-2016 cycle for a better deal. What they want is a number of things that would immediately and directly affect their quality of life. Higher wages, particularly at the lower end of the spectrum. This is a distinctly higher minimum wage. The demand is coalesced around $15 an hour. And it's interesting to say that over time, I was just in correspondence with a actually conservative activist who allied with me. He was more influential than I was on the question of a higher minimum wage. And reflecting that 8 years ago we started demanding $12 an hour for minimum wage, and now that is the average minimum wage in the country. At the time it was considered to be a completely outlandish demand. But the movement has moved on, and 15 is now the target. The present federal minimum wage is not quite half that, $7.25 an hour. So higher minimum wage would make a distinctly important effect on younger workers who are, particularly those entering in the service industries who have very little bargaining power and very little prospect otherwise of getting an improvement in their wage conditions. Second thing that young voters want is universal health care. Because this is the population which has the most difficulty getting and holding health insurance, and perhaps least likely to have it provided by employers once they're past the age of 26, no longer eligible for being covered by their parents. They fall into a gap. And of course they have health issues, including issues related to fertility. So you have an important question of the availability of health insurance for this population. And the third thing is education costs, as this is the generation which is immersed in the problem of student debt. And often in order to even make a stab at joining a higher strata economically, have to take on a substantial amount of debt, which then becomes an obstacle to every other form of normal, let's say, economic development, forming of a household, buying a house, so on and so forth. Well, it's interesting that whether he did it intentionally or not is not entirely clear, although he's a very shrewd figure, that the avatar, the symbol of the demands of the younger population, is the oldest guy in the race. And that's Bernie Sanders, independent socialist senator from Vermont, who has been in elected office now for 40 years, in the Congress for 30, in the Senate, I don't know, for 12 or so. And Bernie Sanders, who was the only candidate who dared to challenge Hillary Clinton for the nomination in 2016, has been developing his position and his base and his organization and his funding very consistently and very steadily over the past 5 years. And is now, in spite of the fact that he was considered until a few weeks ago as totally improbable as the nominee by the major American press, is now coming to realize that it's not improbable at all. And it's very interesting. What you have is, if you leave aside Joe Biden, who's clearly yesterday's man, could end up with a nomination this time, but is not a feature of the future of the party. If you consider who is really emerging from the race at the present time, the two figures of interest are Sanders and the otherwise insignificant figure who's 37 years old and the mayor of a small city in Indiana, Pete Buttigieg, who is an absolute avatar of the yuppie professional class. Rhodes Scholar, military intelligence officer, McKinsey consultant, who then sort of went to back to his hometown and became mayor in order to develop basically to develop a political profile, following a path that was pioneered, I think, largely by Barack Obama. So it's interesting that you have an old working class guy who is actually the tip of the spear, if you like, of a youth movement, and a young urban professional who is let's say, the up-and-coming spear carrier of the traditional or the Clinton-era coalition in the Democratic Party. Does Bernie Sanders have a chance? I think at the moment, as I said, he has a narrow path to the presidency, but it's an open path. It's a path that is strongly resisted, has had the enormous advantage of being resisted and underrated, in fact, ruled out of account by the media, and by the leadership of the Democratic Party up until now. They simply didn't want to face the possibility, and as a result, they underrated it, and they consistently put their money and their backing and their attention onto other candidates who did not have the same levels of experience, organization, stability, and funding that Sanders has. And they've now found at this point that the alternatives are practically exhausted. If you watched the debate a couple of months ago, you can see some evidence of that in the way the interaction between Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. His path to the presidency, if he wins the nomination, is, I think, fairly straightforward. It's not necessarily the case that it would prevail. There would be an enormous amount of character assassination and the dredging up of ideological labels. Americans going to vote for a socialist and so on and so forth. But it's the strength of Sanders' possibilities lies in the fact that as a basically working class guy with a very, if you like, lowbrow appeal, urban professionals tend to regard him as your hectoring uncle who went to community college. They don't think of him as what he is, which is actually quite disciplined, enormously disciplined, experienced political professional. But his appeal exactly of that type would stand him a reasonable chance of reclaiming the states that are drifting away, the states that gave Trump the presidency, again, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. I believe he's leading in polls against Donald Trump in all of those states. Not doing so well in the South. He's less well known and where the demography does not necessarily favor him. But in the states that would be crucial to cementing a majority in the Electoral College, Sanders has the most reasonable possibilities. If that doesn't happen, if Sanders is not the nominee, if it's Biden, and I don't think it will be any of the other candidates, then I would bet that Donald Trump will be reelected, that he is not going to lose any of the other states that he won in 2016. He's not going to gain any of the states that Hillary Clinton won, but he's much more likely to hold on to the states that made a substantial difference. And this is, after all, a president who is will be able to say that he was presided over an additional 4 years of economic expansion, a very low unemployment rate, and a situation in which there's, at least for all of the bluster and tensions and troubles, no significant additional wars which draw in the young people of those working class states much more than they do those from either the East or the West Coast. Okay, let me just talk a little bit about what would happen if in a Sanders presidency and what it would mean from the standpoint of economic performance or economic policy of the United States. I have an essay on this which will appear a week before the Iowa caucuses in Project Syndicate. It's entitled "Can Bernie Do It?" Which is an obvious takeoff on John Maynard Keynes and Lloyd George in 1929. Can Lloyd George do it? And what I tried to do was to give a kind of economist's précis or overview of the economic program that Sanders would present. I'm not talking about whether it could be enacted or not, but Sanders' presidency would largely consist of presenting massive challenges to the Congress, which would have the backing of substantial popular forces in the country, and then to see what would happen when the dust settles after a political struggle over the viability of those programs. At the moment, the votes do not exist to enact them, but that can change. The reality is, on a great many of these issues, 5 or 6 years ago, they were not being discussed at all. And now they're emerging as part of the discussion, and this is a cumulative process. After a certain number of years, that which was previously off the table becomes, in some sense, the accepted path forward, and we'll see what happens. So there are 2 parts of the Sanders program. One of them is a set of issues around which his campaign was framed in 2016. I call this the core of Sanders. And they are issues which, as I said before, had the effect of coalescing around him an enthusiastic base of young people. I have to say, people who knew Bernie Sanders, and I'm a part-time Vermonter, and I know a lot of people who knew him very well, I know him somewhat, did not think of him as a possible or plausible presidential candidate. They think of him as an irascible old man. But what drew me in was actually one of my daughters, who was 17 at the time, who was tracking this and said, "Do you see what's going on? People turning out at his rallies." This is 2015, 2016. And I realized this was a phenomenon that I had not seen since I was her age, since the campaigns of Eugene McCarthy and George McGovern in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So what was drawing them in? Now, I mentioned them before. The minimum wage, exceedingly important. Universal health care, Medicare for all. Medicare is a social insurance program, socialized insurance program that was introduced in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson for the population over 65. It's exceedingly popular and effective and low cost. And the idea of extending it to the whole population is eminently understandable. It would mean that hospitalizations and other essential care would be covered by a public insurance program to a very large degree. There are a lot of problems associated with the administration of health care in the United States now. If you try to move to the Medicare model, transition for smaller hospitals and so forth, highly costly structure of American health care would undergo a very significant restructuring over time. But all of that is secondary in most people's minds to the fact that they would end up with a very substantial improvement, ending up without having to pay co-pays and co-insurance and so forth, and premiums, especially premiums that they're now saddled with if they can get health insurance at all. The third piece was initially framed as free, tuition-free public universities. Again, I think it would be quite difficult to implement, but the appeal of not having to pay exorbitant tuition rates in order to attend a decent public university, and the public sector has a very large presence in universities in the United States, is enormous. Something along these lines that would permit most people to graduate with adequate professional technical degrees without having a burden of debt is enormously popular. And then on top of that, Sanders has proposed a restructuring of the banking system reduction in the scale, and particularly of the mega banks, which are understandably as a result of the financial crisis, objects of the deepest suspicion in the American population generally, but especially amongst younger people. And dealing with a bank, particularly a large and impersonal one, is a very unpleasant and difficult experience. That's the original Sanders program. And the interesting thing about it is that when you look at it in detail, it's not a program of economic expansion. In fact, most of the measures in it are contractionary in their effect. They would reduce overall economic activity. If you reduce the scale of American healthcare from 18% of GDP to 16 or 14, you're taking a major bite out of economic activity in the United States. That may be unnecessary economic activity. It may be that the health status of the population would not be affected by this, but a lot of jobs and the work of a great many central cities in the United States is today hospital work and healthcare work would be affected. Similarly, reducing the scale of the banking sector would have a dramatic effect in certain places like New York. Raising the minimum wage is somewhat expansionary, but not necessarily very much so. Reducing costs of college is kind of probably a wash in that it helps the financial position of the students, but it hurts the financial position of the colleges, who would then be subject to somewhat more strict budget restraints than they are now. So there's nothing in the original program that would actually work on the whole to expand the economy. But then you come to what's been added in the 2020 campaign. And there's one other thing which would be contractionary, which would be reduction in military spending and an end to these excessive commitments overseas that have characterized American policy for a long time. But against this would be a very, very substantial expansionary program, and that's the Green New Deal. That's a program of public investment, not terribly well defined at this point, but clearly aimed at transforming the sources and uses of energy in order to greatly increase the sustainable and renewable elements. And that's, of course, an industrial project. It's a project that would require a major upgrading of the whole infrastructure of the country, as well as the production of the machinery, windmills, solar panels, and so forth, that would be necessary in order to make a substantial dent in the present use of fossil fuels. The campaign against fossil fuels is a campaign of reindustrialization, in at least the short, medium, and over the transition period. And a campaign of reindustrialization is a campaign to essentially do something serious about the industrial regions of the country which have been neglected for the last 40 years. So the Green New Deal has a very important element, if you take it seriously as a proposition, of economic expansion and the, let's say, the creation of new spheres of industrial activity for the first time in really more than a generation, the first time since the Reagan era, which shut down a great many of these enterprises that had existed before that. And there's another thing which has come in to the Sanders campaign, which is, I think, even more radical potentially in what it could achieve. And that is, he's begun to talk about forgiving canceling entire classes of debt, essentially treating it as odious. Student debt, let's just say, but we're not going to have, if new students are going to be able to go to college without having to pay exorbitant tuition rates, take on debt to do so, why should previous generations still have to service the debts that they took out? That is a very challenging proposal in important ways, because it raises all kinds of questions of horizontal equity. What about people who have already paid off their debts, and potential for resentment? But at the same time, it gets to a fundamental feature of American society, which is the effectively debt peonage, effectively the way in which American households are conditioned to take on debt and then to service it and then to work in order to service their debts. If the alternative becomes available to people of seeing a political program to actually have these debts canceled with associated restructuring of the financial sector, this could have very interesting effects on the population's attitude toward the economic system as a whole. And there's a second category of debt which has entered this discussion recently, which is healthcare debt, medical debt. Cancel those too. Now, suggesting that, I think Sanders is kind of opening the door to some very radical reforms, unprecedented radical reforms that, again, are not well defined at this point. They're more in the nature of talking points, position papers, than they are legislative program. But nevertheless, they have the potential to crystallize a very interesting range of political movements. And overall, if you take the Green New Deal and the debt forgiveness together, the expanded Sanders program, what is going on, in, what has been added in 2020, offsets the contractionary effects of the original Sanders program. And I would argue that on the whole, although it's a radical proposition, it's, at least from an economic standpoint, viable in that sense. It involves a reallocation of resources that is not unimaginable or impossible in an economy that's already operating not close to capacity, but fairly close, at fairly high levels of employment. We're not talking about a depression situation where you have a kind of need for massive Keynesian stimulus. What you have is an economy which is probably not going to be expanded dramatically overall, but which could have a substantial reallocation of resources with a commitment improvement in sustainability and living standards. Okay, last few remarks about the immediate political situation, because we're now moving toward a trial in the United States Senate over the impeachment of Donald Trump. And this is something which will attract attention, I think, for a while, but rather quickly fade from the scene, and I think it's generally accepted that that's what should happen. Trump is not going to be convicted in the Senate. The movement to impeach him in the House was, in some sense, it started long before the specific elements of the indictment, the impeachment resolution, were known. People behind it were looking to basically consider Trump to be unfit as president. They also challenged his legitimacy given the way he was elected. And their constituents were, in some sense, objected to him in a particularly virulent way. And so, in some sense, what's going on here is a political urge to satisfy a part of the Democratic Party's constituency, which is from parts of the country where there's no chance that the Democrats will lose. But at the same time, it puts at risk the Democratic representatives, particularly some senators, in parts of the country where Trump is much stronger. And this sort of reflects a division inside the party, which has made the Democratic leadership of the House of Representatives quite reluctant to proceed aggressively. They've kept the thing quite narrow with the expectation that it will be disposed of reasonably quickly. What underlies it, unfortunately for international relations, is a very strongly aggressive posture toward Russia and a very strongly supportive policy towards the most aggressive elements in Ukraine. If you follow the discussions, that is the common thread that is actually shared by both Trump's opponents and his defenders in the impeachment case. And So a legacy of the impeachment battle will be a foreign policy consensus on those questions, which I believe is probably going to be more aggressive than it would have been otherwise. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for this very interesting and detailed analysis. I cannot speak for everybody present here, but as far as I'm concerned, it was really a lot of absolutely new things for me, which you just mentioned. Colleagues, you are welcome to put questions or to make comments.
Please speak directly into the microphone. I'm having an episode of hearing difficulties, so that
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I would like to ask you, what do you think about Sanders' foreign policy if he becomes president?
Broadly speaking, well, Sanders has not emphasized foreign policy issues very much, and has, to a degree, stayed within the, let's say, parameters of the broad American consensus, for what it's worth. His orientation on foreign policy is to reduce the military presence of the United States and to work toward to put the emphasis on cooperative relations between the major powers in the common pursuit, particularly of the global policy objectives. That's what the priority would be. It's driven, in effect, is a foreign policy vision driven by two things. One is an opposition to the adventurous wars, Afghanistan, Iraq. Sanders voted against the Iraq war. It's a major point of difference between him and Joe Biden. And reduction of the military budget is a long-standing position on the Democratic left. But especially by climate change. In the sense that if you're going to be serious about it, this has to be done at a global level, and it has to be done with the cooperation of the major countries that are involved in causing the problem to begin with. So you can't have a world in which competition between those countries gets in the way of an effort along those lines.
Yes, please.
Mr. Гэлbreит, thank you very much for the detailed lecture in the issues dealing with situation in economic situation in America and electoral geography. I have a couple of questions dealing with current political situation, dealing with forthcoming Iowa caucuses and generally the Democratic Party primaries. As we know, that Biden has the highest chances to become the nominee from the Democratic Party for November elections. But as for number 2 and number 3, you talked a lot about Bernie Sanders. But as we know that number 2 and number 3 politicians in the Democratic Party nowadays are Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and they have for me, nearly the same agenda, political agenda. They're both progressive politicians, we would say leftist in Russia, but in America, like progressive wing of the Democratic Party. In their agenda, political agenda, they speak about climatic issues, they speak about low income, Medicare, more or less the same. And to my mind, they like interfere each other in political scene and Democratic Party. If there occasionally one candidate from leftist spectrum of Democratic Party, it could be maybe he or she will have more chances to beat Joe Biden to become nominee. And sorry, one short question about dealing with electoral geography. You spoke about the Ohio, Michigan, and the other states of so-called American Rust Belt, about the decisive role of American Rust Belt for elections in America, but traditionally decisive role. And I would like to ask if there are any new battlefields that you expect in November, like new decisive states, not the traditional ones, because you said that Rust Belt is moving slightly to Republican agenda. Is there any Republican states that moving slightly to the Democratic agenda? Thank you so much.
Yeah, and just addressing the second part first, the states of the Southwest and the South, which have been Republican now for a generation. When I moved to Texas in 1985, it was a solid, well, it wasn't solidly Democratic, but in '82 it had elected a solidly Democratic state government. And it continued to elect Democrats into the late 1980s. Since then, no Democrats at the state level, zero. Texas is moving back toward the Democrats. And this is a purely demographic phenomenon. Cities are always inhabited by relatively well-off, young, relatively liberal people. And the minority populations, particularly the Hispanic population, growing very rapidly. So the place that's closest to flipping Democratic, if it hasn't already done so, is Arizona. Arizona elected a Democratic senator in 2018 for the first time in many years, since I guess the Dennis DeConcini in the early 80s. As I say, Georgia, very close, but these states are not yet ready to flip. For the most part, Arizona may have flipped, but the others are probably not quite ready. But they will over time. So you have this kind of shift in the political geography of the country that's going on. But it's a bit of a dilemma for the Democrats because they've lost already in the three critical states of the upper Midwest, and they haven't won yet in the South. So transition is not necessarily favorable to the Democrats just yet. The other question was about the other left candidate, which is Elizabeth Warren, essentially. Is that correct? And I didn't speak of her very much. Elizabeth Warren has done very well in this race for someone who is running for the first time at the national level. But running for the first time is exceedingly difficult thing to do. You're not known outside of your own state. She had some advantages, some national profile, but generally speaking, you're a local figure, right? And particularly if you're relatively recent and you haven't had any important national exposure, which Barack Obama, as a previous case of this, did get in 2004 with a big speech at the Democratic Convention. Elizabeth Warren hadn't had that. Considering that she was doing this for the first time, she did very well. But her issue base is not very wide. She's very good on bankruptcy and household issues and on banking. She was very good as overseer of the bailout. But this is a narrow spectrum of domestic policy concerns. She doesn't have the depth of experience, both policy and, I would say, political experience that Sanders has. Sanders has been in the game for decades longer, and you develop a certain instinct about how much to say and when to stop saying it. And so what Elizabeth Warren did was to develop a campaign that was based upon having plans. Her slogan was, "I have a plan for that," right? Which is appealing to a certain demographic, but to the broader part of the population, it looks a little bit busy. It looks a little bit contrived. And some of the plans were brought in from, let's call them celebrity academics. The wealth tax, for example, which is a non-functional proposal. So what has happened with Warren is that she initially went up and then ran into some difficulty because of identity issues, the Native American question. And then she came back from that, went very nicely, but she basically peaked some weeks ago and has been now falling back into third or fourth position, sometimes behind Buttigieg in the polls. So my guess is, and I've always felt this way, that when it comes down to it, the test for Elizabeth Warren will be in New Hampshire, where she's a neighboring state senator and Sanders is a neighboring state senator, and his advantage is that he was on the ballot there 4 years ago and he got about 80%. Or not, no, 60%. So he did very well in New Hampshire. He cleaned up. And so it was going to be hard for her to get past that. And I think she probably is looking at a campaign which is at best going to come into the convention in third place and not be in a position to secure the nomination.
Thank you. I have a question about the Green New Deal. This Tuesday, CEO of BlackRock has mentioned in his letter that the evidence of climate risks is very obvious, and the near future, and sooner than most anticipate, there will be a significant reallocation of capital due to climate change. Well, when a CEO of BlackRock says something like this, then you might feel that whoever becomes the next president, a big reallocation of capital will take place, whichever the policy is. So, what are your thoughts on this climate change and Green New Deal relocation? Would it bring more inequality in revenues? Will the reallocation of capital due to climate change and due to Green Deal bring more inequality in revenues, inequality of life, or will it make them life more equal but sustain the inequality in revenues?
I mean, that's an exceedingly good question. And to the extent that I've helped to try to conceptualize what the Green New Deal needs to be, and I organized a conference in Austin on this last November called New Deals in Europe and America. Actually, I've made more contribution, I think, to the European versions as articulated by, amongst others, the Democracy in Europe movement than I have to the American one. But the essential point is that the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, was a comprehensive social and structural project. We think about it historically as being a kind of, sometimes we think about it as being a kind of general purpose Keynesianism. Keynes had very little influence on the New Deal. It was a program that built up a previously non-existent system of social insurance and protections, along with a massive electrification and industrialization across the south and southwest of the country, which had been neglected since the Civil War, had endured 7 decades of economic stagnation and deep poverty. And that was something that was transforming. It's what brought the South into the modern world and kept the South in the Democratic Party until the time of Lyndon Johnson. So Tennessee Valley Authority, Lower Colorado River Authority, the dams in the west on the Colorado River and so forth. So these are crucial aspects of it. And the Green New Deal would have to take on some of that same coloration, that is to say, combining social protections, universal health care in particular, with energy transformation. What is it going to do to the quality of life is really a kind of challenging question, because it's an investment program. And an investment program does not directly affect the quality of life. I mean, since the electricity coming out of your is the same as it was before, it just comes from a cleaner source. So other than the long-term effects, which one hopes would stave off of help to stave off planetary disaster, you're looking at putting a lot of resources into things whose immediate effects are not visible at all, other than providing jobs and income. It's in some sense economically a bit like wartime mobilization. You have to do it, you produce a lot of output, and nobody gets to see it, nobody gets to consume it. So you have to think about how to make the incomes, spread them out, so that, and which is what the wartime administration did, and this was something my father was responsible for actually in the 40s, which was to assure that the American public acquired bonds which matured over time, which then supported consumption in later decades. And that actually works pretty well, because what it does is to give households who already have enough immediate consumption, what they didn't have before was a sense of security. Right? And so I think that's how you sell it, that you're providing people with both environmental security and financial security for the long term. Not necessarily with anything that they can immediately eat or drink or wear or drive. And you've got to hope that they'll take that part in.
This is my question as an addition to the question of the man here. You don't think that there is a contradiction between economic activity and environmental security? I talked to Joseph Stiglitz to this issue, and he said that there is a really contradiction between the two aims here. And what do you think? And what maybe we have to reduce economic activity and not to be admired by economic growth, or you think that they are compatible with each other?
So I'm not quite catching.
I would ask you about your position to the discussion about environmental security and economic growth, even if economic growth is healthy economic growth or sustainable. From my point of view, even sustainable economic growth predicts preserving of human environment or environment security.
Environmental security, does it require a reduction of current consumption? Is that your point?
Yeah, and consumption and economic activity. Then I think that the Joseph Stiglitz said GDP as an indicator is
so just to recapitulate, because again, I'm having trouble with my hearing today. But the question is whether environmental security requires significant reduction of current consumption. Yeah.
not current consumption anyway, but economic activity and GDP growth.
Well, that's I guess my view of that is that, and this is informed by the work of physicist friends of mine in Texas, that we want to transform the structure of the production of energy to the extent that it's technically feasible to do so. You have to put a lot of new infrastructure in the ground, and you have to reorganize life. Right? The American life is organized around the daily commute by automobile from the suburbs into the city. That's where the energy consumption is. I mean, to a very large extent. Right? So you either, people have to move in to live in more, I mean, what you have in Moscow is much more sustainable. People have to move to live closer together and on transport networks that are less energy and fossil fuel intensive. Or you have to distribute work in such a way that people don't have to move so much in order to do it. You have to be able to think about how to do this appropriately in a very decentralized country, very decentralized living situation. I think that technically it's very challenging. Do I think that one can have a superior quality of life on a different energy model? Probably you can. There are lots of things about the American quality of life that can be improved. I mean, I think, but you have to be imaginative, and people have to buy into the idea. In terms of the straightforward energy transformation, my view is that this involves, in the transition period, an increased level of economic activity. And it involves, unfortunately, an increased level of extraction and use of fossil fuels. Because you have to build the equipment. And so in order to do this at the global level, you have to retire certain capital equipment and create new capital equipment. That uses a lot of metals, a lot of glass, a lot of energy to do this. So the capital goods producing sector becomes a bigger thing in the short term as you make the transition, and then you have to maintain it. So in order to get to a point where you're sustaining, you have to essentially pass through this transition phase. If you don't do that, then over the long run, you're continuing to increase the use of the fossil fuels, and you're doomed. Okay? So there's a price you pay to make the transition. That I think is the realistic view of the matter. Has the realistic view of the matter dominated in the political discussion so far? No, it does not. It's there's a kind of a belief in what's called bootstrapping, and the idea that you are simply going to be able to make the transition within the envelope of existing energy uses and energy sources. And I'm skeptical. I think that you're going to have to use more in the short run in order to get to a sustainable place in the longer run.
Thank you.
One political question. What do you think about the idea of leadership of Democratic Party to organize impeachment for Trump? Will it strengthen the chances against Trump or vice versa?
What is the political effects of the impeachment?
Yeah, for both parties. Is it absolutely clear that impeachment will fail? Or you don't think so?
Yeah, say that again.
Impeachment for Trump will not lead to the resign of Trump.
Yeah,
Is
is Trump going to benefit from the impeachment? Well, it'll be over in a few weeks. There will be a Senate vote to acquit him, and he will announce that he's been vindicated. Everybody knows this. I think there's no new information. There was no new information in the impeachment because everybody knew the House was going to impeach. That was baked in from the election result in 2018. And everybody knows that he's going to be acquitted. So, on the surface of it, I think there's no information in this. The wild card concerns how the investigations that are still ongoing what they will reveal, if anything, about the underpinnings of this affair. And there are several respects in which the things to look for. There's ongoing investigation of the Steele dossier. And that is discussed at length in the Inspector General's report, the Department of Justice, the Horowitz report that was published a little while ago. And there are some very interesting questions that are still open on that. And there is the report of the special prosecutor, which was working out of Connecticut at the moment in time. And we'll see just exactly where that leads. If the Democrats were to nominate Joe Biden, then I think that at the end of the day, there were two conflicting narratives. One is that Donald Trump was so afraid of Joe Biden that he went to great lengths to get President Zelensky to announce an investigation and so on and so forth. I think the notion that Trump was particularly afraid of Biden is a very questionable foundation for that argument. And the other possibility is that the Republicans would be able to sell the idea that there was something intrinsically wrong with putting the unqualified son of the vice president on the board of a holding company and paying them $50,000 a month, and that this was done for some reason other than the qualities and intelligence and business leadership of Mr. Hunter Biden, whose qualities and business leadership were otherwise invisible. And I think it's fairly easy to sell the American public on the idea that when you put the unqualified son of the incumbent vice president on your payroll for $50,000 a month, that there's some reason that you're doing it that isn't just because he's uniquely qualified to judge the production of and trading of natural gas in a country that he doesn't know anything about. I mean, common sense will tell the great many Americans that this is probably, something, and that narrative would be very widely disseminated in the event that Joe Biden is the nominee. I think the Democrats have been kidding themselves on this point. I mean, seriously kidding themselves. The idea that he's somehow, being unfairly taken advantage of by even raising the suggestion that there might have been something questionable about their relationship.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Dear Professor, thank you very much for sharing your insights. I'm Lennart from Germany, studying now my graduate program here at the school, and I have a short question. How would you summarize Trump's current track record as president in your eyes?
Try that one more time.
How would you summarize Trump's presidency so far, from your point of view?
Oh. Well, what is it that Marx says at the opening lines of the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, that Hegel says somewhere that history repeats itself the first time tragedy, but neglected to add that the first time tragedy, the second time farce. That, I think, characterizes my view of the Trump era. In many ways, it recapitulates the Reagan era with respect to policy. You have a major reduction of taxes on the wealthy. Trump's own instinct, which was to spend heavily on infrastructure, was thwarted by the Republican leadership in the Congress, and nothing happened on that front. And then you have, even though Trump's instincts, like Reagan's, were essentially not very aggressive, there's an underlying drive toward continued very strong international and military presence in the world. And the result was, in 1984, Reagan was reelected on the strength of a strong economic recovery, Trump will be able to make the same claim. I would not be surprised to see Trump reelected on that basis. I think defeating him, the Democrats have had two strategies. Basically, the major forces in the Democratic Party pursued one strategy, which is personal, the evident personal deficiencies of Donald Trump as a person. They tried this with Reagan too. Reagan was old and senile. Reagan was not so old or senile as he was made out to be, and proved to be very adept in dealing with Walter Mondale in 1984. And if you dealt with if the Democrats put up a figure like that, it would be Joe Biden, with very conventional ideas, nothing original to offer. And Biden's considerably less powerful personality than Mondale was. Then I suspect that the history would repeat. The only way to beat Trump is to have something which actually mobilizes constituencies that have not been active before, and to do so in an effective way. That's why I say, if they're not brave enough to nominate and throw everything they in behind Bernie Sanders, they're probably going to see Trump for another 4 years.
May I throw in something quick? Do you agree with the statement that USA has energy independence? He's claiming this quite often.
Yeah, well, I think the fact is the U.S. is now a net exporter of energy, and the reason for it, this has nothing to do with Trump, but is that it's really a development in the last decade, which is the fracking of the shale basins in initially North Dakota, Pennsylvania, but now especially the Permian Basin in West Texas, which turns out to have sort of the right geological characteristics. It's kind of mushy, and you pump in a lot of high pressure water, you get a lot of stuff out. It's quite amazing how much the U.S. energy production has gone up. How sustainable it is a very open question, because apparently financially this is just a deep, deep hole, putting a lot of money on the expectation that these wells will pay off. But if they don't last long enough to pay off, that money's all going to be lost. And so we'll see. I mean, it could be that you're looking at a very steep bell curve of Hubbard's peak in production and decline. And that's a question, again, one of the advantages of working in Texas and at the University in Texas is that a lot of people know about as much about this as anybody who's not actually in the industry can know. And they don't know. So, there we are.
Firstly, Professor Гэлбрейт, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very interesting. And secondly, if it's possible, I would like to ask you two political questions. First is, what do you think about, is there any possibility that the Iranian question will degree so-called President Trump's level of trust? And the second one, does it mean that voting for Joe Biden is voting for Barack Obama policy because of the fact that he was his vice president and they had such close relations between each other, and so that means that if Joe Biden wins in 2020 elections, that the United States will have the return of Medicare, Obama policy, and just some kind of other things. Thank you.
Okay, so the first question was, you said the first part of your question was about Iran. The current situation with Iran.
Yes.
Yeah.
The influence of the situation.
Yeah. Well, I think we're looking at some things which were, first of all, caught the American establishment by surprise. the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, and the result of that is still very much up in the air. On the one hand, the Iranians demonstrated very persuasively, just as a matter of show, that the American presence in the Middle East is extremely vulnerable. They can do what they want. The chance, if you looked at that air base they hit with missiles, the chance of hitting 3 buildings with 3 missiles, when you have about 18% of the air base is covered with buildings, is less than 1%, unless those missiles are extremely accurate. And they evidently are extremely accurate. And there's no defense. So that's sort of an obvious lesson which is being taken on board. But at the same time, using the power, Iran did not use that power in this last exchange. And they refrained. And the reason they refrained is obvious, that there's a potential for escalation, things getting totally out of control is present. So it's just kind of a standoff at the moment. My guess is that if the standoff persists, its political effects in the United States are not very large. Because these things come and go pretty quickly in the American consciousness. If there is a calamity, then political effects are unpredictable. On the one hand, there's a rally around the flag instinct, particularly if substantial numbers of Americans are actually killed. On the other, the American public is broadly speaking anti-war, and broadly speaking extremely tired of what are now widely thought of as pointless involvement in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the confrontation with Iran. In 1970, I was around in 1979, and I remember you had a kind of spontaneous, popular animosity toward the Iranian revolution, the Iranian regime, as a result of the hostage crisis, which went on for over a year and helped destroy Jimmy Carter's presidency. There's no animosity now. I mean, people, it's 40 years later, people don't have the same, the military may hold that grudge, and a grudge not so much about 79, but about 83, the Marine barracks in Beirut. I think it's a very serious, long-standing issue with people who were young officers then and top leadership now. But in the American public, Iran's just another country. They have no interest in having another war, and they recognize, of course, that it would be a much more difficult war than Afghanistan or Iraq.
Yeah, and the second question was about the return of the policy of Barack Obama, because if there was the election of Joe Biden as the next president, if Joe Biden wins the campaign, does that mean that the policy of Barack Obama will return?
You mean, would we return to a negotiation with Iran on...
No. Also, speaking about the policy, because
internal policy.
Obama returns to his policy in Medicare.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Biden administration would be a retread of the Obama administration, which was a retread of the Clinton administration. And so you'll be looking at a generation of policymakers who would have very little new initiative and very little energy to pursue anything particularly radical. And it's simply, I mean, if you look at how Joe Biden is, there isn't anything there except as a placeholder for the existing Democratic establishment. And that itself is an exhausted group of I think the right word is apparatchik.
Thank you. Okay. Any more questions?
No.
May I ask you a question, Jamie? After the presidential campaign, what is your guess about the role of Ukraine and Russia in your agenda, in the agenda of United States politics? Will this problem will be minimized, or will it stay long?
Well, if you look at the impeachment proceedings, a fact was that the underlying narrative was an extraordinarily, let's say, forward policy with respect to Ukraine. It was the Poroshenko policy, and it's a narrative being advanced by people in the American state who were closely allied with the Poroshenko government. So the real question now is whether the Ukrainian government is still interested in, or can still be moved in that direction. And if there were a substantial movement toward peace between Russia and Ukraine now, then I would imagine that this initiative and this position of the U.S. policy would end up being quite isolated. But if there isn't, and if it was clearly that what we were dealing with the big people who appeared in the impeachment process, Ambassador Yovanovitch, and the Lieutenant Colonel Vindeman, and the National Security former official Fiona Hill, and others, was a concert of, I wouldn't call it pro-Ukraine, but pro the particular factions in Ukraine that actually lost in the most recent Ukrainian election. Whether they are permanently out, I mean, nothing is permanently finished in politics, so what their position will be in the future, we don't know. But that would strike me as the crucial determinant. Unfortunately, it does lock in a narrative which has, well, let's just say, its correspondence to the realities of the situation are incidental.
Thank you. We have to end our discussion because Jamie has to go back to the Gaidar Forum, and they have a meeting there with, which was previously announced with the Deputy Prime Minister. Now it's not quite clear whether it's acting Deputy Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister. In any case, I believe that we have to say thank you so much, Jamie. And I would like, it was really great. And in order to supplement a little bit what Jamie has been saying today, I would like just to quote the final paragraph of his lecture. You have it, and you can see it. And it sounds like this. And when Bernie Sanders, who does not need my advice, becomes president next year, I'll throw in with him for what it may be worth. I have hopes for a better world, free of imperial delusions, maximally demilitarized, authentically democratic, not too unequal, working together on common problems, saving the planet for a while longer. Very good ideas, I think.